Hey class. This week we're going to be talking about the learning and situational factors that can be attributed to criminal behavior. Some of this might have been, if you all have taken any general psychology classes, some of this was probably a little bit of review for you because a lot of the theories covered in this chapter we also cover in general psychology. And if not, then I'm sure it was a very interesting reading. So when we're talking about learning, we are talking about three different types of learning. The first type is classical conditioning, and if you've ever heard of Pavlov's dogs, Pavlov is the researcher who came up with the classical conditioning experiments. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So that's Pavlovian. And then there's instrumental learning, and that's operant conditioning. And then there's social learning. So these are the three types of learning that we're going to be discussing. So again, going back to Pavlov, if you ever took psychology, you would have learned about what his experiments were. Maybe you've heard about them in your own life. This was when he did an experiment with dogs and taught them that the ringing of a bell meant that their food was going to be given to them quickly after that. So what he observed was that prior to ringing the bell and having that associated with giving them their food, they would start salivating when they saw their food. And then through the use of the bell, they started to relate the bell to being fed. So they started to salivate when they heard the bell. So the classical conditioning perspective is that there's a neutral stimulus with a closely following rewarding or painful event, and the alert will eventually and automatically connect the stimulus with the reward or the pain. So the dogs, of course, connecting the ringing of the bell to being fed caused them to begin salivating. In instrumental learning, the learner must do something to the environment in order to obtain a reward, or in some cases, to avoid punishment. Instrumental learning is really based on learning the consequences of a behavior. So if you do something, there is some probability that a certain rewarding event or perhaps an avoidance of punishment will occur. So a child learning that one parent gives in to a tantrum and one parent holds a boundary, so they start going to the parent who gives in, is an example of this instrumental learning. Social learning is more complex than either of these two, classical conditioning or instrumental, because it really involves learning from watching others and organizing social experiences in the brain. Okay, next we're going to talk about the concept of behaviorism. Behaviorism is a perspective that focuses on observable, measurable behavior and argues that the social environment and learning are the key determinants of human behavior. So I know last week we were talking about sort of those biological factors and genetic factors and all that. Behaviorism is saying that it is social environment and learning are really the key determinants of behavior. So it's an important differentiation. John B. Watson is sort of the father of behaviorism. This sort of all began in 1913 with the publication of Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. And really talking about kind of how behaviorism measures that really the only way to study and describe psychology is by studying behavior, because there is no way to really gauge or measure internal processes for different people. And he was also really convinced that the fundamental goal of psychology was to understand, predict, and control human behavior, and that really only a very rigid scientific approach could accomplish this. He was really greatly influenced by Pavlov and the research on classical conditioning. Again, we kind of just talked about that. Classical conditioning is the process of learning to respond to a formerly neutral stimulus that has been paired with another stimulus that already elicits a response, also called Pavlovian conditioning. So again, before the dogs learned that the bell was related to their food, they would have had really no response to hearing a bell ringing, right? It's the idea that they were able to associate over time the ringing of the bell with their food, and then that is what created the response. Watson really thought that psychology should focus exclusively on the interplay between stimulus and response. So a stimulus is a person, object, or event that elicits behavior. A response is the elicited behavior. Watson was convinced that all behavior, both animal and human, was controlled by the external environment in a way similar to that described by Pavlov in his initial study. So stimulus produces response. Another really important name in behaviorism is B.F. Skinner, and he was really the most influential psychologist in the United States in the 20th century. And this really, this behaviorism, there was this big movement in psychology to try to really alter behavior through these kind of conditioning modalities, and that was really implemented in prison settings and also in therapeutic treatment settings to try to alter behaviors. So Skinner's theory of behavior, Skinner really believed that the primary goal of psychology is the prediction and control of behavior, so very much like Watson. He also believed that environmental or external stimuli are the primary, if not the sole, determinants of all behavior, both human and animal. So the environmental stimuli become independent variables, and the behaviors they elicit are the dependent variables. In the behavioral sciences, a variable is any entity or behavior that can be measured. A behavior or response is called dependent because it is under the control of or dependent on one or more independent variables. Skinner did sort of vary from Watson in that he did really acknowledge the presence of mental activity and cognitive processes, but did believe that it was really irrelevant to the outcome of somebody's behavior. So again, kind of like fully believing that all of behavior is controlled by these independent and dependent variables. So when we're talking about behaviorism as a method of science, to keep it without bias and objective, the behavior must be publicly observed by others so that, you can't just say, oh, this is what happened and have nobody else observe it, because that's a big hole in the scientific process, right? It needs to be seen by others instead of just the person collecting the data. The data must be comparable, and then there's also the importance of situationism, which is a theoretical perspective that argues that environmental stimuli control behavior. So personal characteristics and other internal factors of the person have little to do with determining behavior. Independent thinking and free will are largely myths. Animals, including humans, react like complicated robots to their environments. The environmental stimuli and the range of reactions are complex and infinite, but with careful research, this complexity is not unmanageable. So the environmental stimuli completely controls behavior, is this behaviorism model. So Skinner really accepted the basic tenets of classical conditioning, but also asserted that we need an additional type of conditioning to account more fully for all forms of behavior. In Pavlov's experiments on classical conditioning, the dogs did not operate on their environments to receive rewards. The event, which was the food, occurred regardless of what they did. Skinner called this responding conditioning and contrasted it with a situation in which a subject does something that affects the situation. So in other words, subjects, now called participants in psychological experiments, behave in such a way that reinforcement is forthcoming. Operant conditioning, then, is a form of learning in which a voluntary response is strengthened or diminished by its consequences. And this is also called instrumental learning. So operant conditioning, if you get a reward for something, right? If there's a behavior that you do and you get a reward for that, that encourages you to continue that behavior. On the flip side, if you do a behavior and you have a negative consequence for that behavior, that discourages you from continuing to do that behavior. So then we're going to talk about different types of reinforcement. Skinner called rewards reinforcement, defining the term as anything that increases the probability of future responding. So reinforcement can also be positive or negative. In positive reinforcement, we gain something we desire as a consequence of certain behavior. So spending hours practicing a difficult piece on the keyboard or perfecting a ski jump, and we're rewarded by praise, right, from the listeners, or, receiving a medal in a ski competition. That's positive reinforcement. Also, like giving your child an allowance, right, or money for doing chores, and then them being able to buy a toy would be positive reinforcement for doing their chores. In negative reinforcement, we avoid an unpleasant event or stimulus as a consequence of certain behavior. So an example of this is if as a child you were able to avoid the unpleasantness of certain school days by feigning illness, your malingering was negatively reinforced. Therefore, you are more likely to engage in it again at a future date under similar circumstances. You were sick on high school dress-up day, class discussion day, in a difficult college course, or the day the district superintendent was scheduled to visit the office. So both positive and negative reinforcement increase the likelihood of future behavior, if that makes sense. Negative reinforcement is needs to be distinguished from punishment and extinction. So in punishment, an organism receives noxious or painful stimuli as consequences of behavior, such as being slapped or hit for being bad. that's an extreme example, but yes. Um, in extinction, a person or animal receives neither reinforcement nor punishment, and just sort of, there's this eventual disappearance of a conditioned or learned response when it's no longer reinforced, right? So when it's no longer in kind of acknowledged, when you think about like a little kid um, poking somebody incessantly on the arm, right? And when that person does not elicit any kind of reaction, eventually that behavior is extinct, right? Because there is no reinforcement either way. Skinner, this is also important. Skinner, and if you took general psychology, you also learned about this, that punishment is a less effective way to eliminate behavior because it just suppresses it temporarily. At a later time, under the right conditions, the response is very likely to occur. Extinction is really far more effective. So once, the organism or person learns that this behavior is not bringing any kind of reinforcement at all, the behavior will be dropped. And that's why it's termed extinction, because it's extinct. Table 4.1 on page 104 gives you a nice breakdown of these different concepts: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. Okay, so then taking a look at operant learning and crime. So, according to Skinner, human beings are born neutral, neither bad nor good. Culture, society, and the environment shape behavior. So, therefore, behavior will be labeled good, bad, or indifferent as society chooses. And what is judged as good behavior in one society or culture may be labeled bad in another. So then when we're talking about Skinner's idea of how to, change society and eliminate crime, he really believed that trying to, searching for individual dispositions or personality that lead to criminal conduct are not worth anything, because really people are ultimately just determined by the environment in which they live, right? So he said that, genetics might play into it a little bit, but it's a very minor role. And really the dominant player here is that operant conditioning, right? The reinforcement of behavior, and that is how people behave in the world. Today, I think that these ideas of conditioning and negative and positive reinforcement and punishment, I think they are very important concepts. And also, most psychologists today would agree that it's just this strict, you know, that this is so black and white, right? Like it's only based on this conditioning and the operant condition is probably a little too limiting, right? And doesn't take into account individuals' personal struggles or differences or anything like that. So I think that's important to remember as we're discussing these things. So then social learning. Social learning theory really has an emphasis on cognitive processes, thinking and remembering. And it really suggests that to understand criminal behavior, we must examine perceptions, thoughts, expectancies, competencies, and values. Each person has his or own version of the world and lives by that version. So This really has to do also with the idea of learning from people around us, right? Learning from people in our environment, um, and the social learning theorists really believe that the social environment is the most important factor in the acquisition of most human behaviors. So humans are basically social creatures, and that's how we learn, right? What behavior to engage in. Um, what they do agree, though, on is the necessity of reinforcement for the maintenance of a behavior, right? So you might engage in a certain behavior, but again, going back to that positive negative reinforcement idea or punishment, that is how it's determined if the behavior continues, right? And with criminal behavior, are there positive reinforcements happening from that behavior? And if so, then that is going to help that behavior continue, right? Expectancy theory. This really is a theory that motivation that takes into account both the expectancy of achieving a particular goal and the value placed on it. So, the hypothesis here is that people enter situations with generalized expectancies about the outcomes of their behavior, right? So, when we are thinking about specifically this course and talking about criminal behavior, we would say that when people engage in unlawful conduct, they are expecting to gain something in the form of status, power, security, affection, or living conditions, right? Like if somebody is physically abusing their children, it's because the person believes that that will make his children comply with his wishes, right? So really labeling a person who breaks the law as immoral, impulsive, crazy, or lacking in ego control fails to include other essential ingredients in the act. So self-regulation, executive function, and moral development are involved. People who act unlawfully really perceive and interpret the situation and select what they consider to be the most effective behavior under the circumstance. So the idea, of course, is that you're, again, the person is engaging in criminal behavior expecting a certain outcome, not just mindlessly engaging in that behavior. Okay, imitational aspects on social learning. So this is really Albert Bandura, and he introduced the idea of observational learning or modeling to the social learning process. So he really contends that much of our behavior is initially acquired by watching others, who are called models. Models are significant persons in the social environment that provide cues for how to do something. So an example in the book is a child learning how to, shoot a gun by imitating the television or video characters, right? Imitational learning is the same idea. So imitational learning is imitating social behavior that somebody's witnessing and then imitating that behavior. According to Bandura, the more significant and respected the models, the greater their impact on our behavior, right? So relevant models include parents, teachers, mentors, siblings, friends, and peers, right? The book talks about, having really famous people kind of doing these public service announcements. And although it seems that that would be effective. Really, what the model is doing is effective. Okay, so like doing a public service announcement for, um, against domestic violence, and then like a famous football player, right, doing that sort of public service announcement, but then them being arrested and charged with domestic violence, right? Their behavior is actually more impactful than, what we're seeing them say in a paid promotional commercial on TV. Um, so again, like this goes back to kind of the idea of what the consequences are too. And when when we see these models having some kind of success based on their behavior, whether that behavior is positive or negative, that acts as reinforcement in the imitational learning model. The differential association reinforcement theory is a theory of deviance developed by Akers that combines Skinner's behaviorism and Sutherland's differential association theory. So the theory states that people learn deviant behavior through the reinforcements they receive from the social environment. So Sutherland is the sociologist who, going back to our definition here of DAR, differential association theory was Sutherland, and he believed that criminal or deviant behavior is learned the same way that all behavior is learned. So, crucial factors are with whom a person associates, for how long, how frequently, how personally meaningful the associations are, and how early they occur in the person's development. So, going back to, again, in previous chapters, right, we've been talking about how important peer relationships are as well for people. And so remembering that comes into play strongly in these social learning theories. So, social and non-social reinforcement. Most of the learning relevant to deviant behavior is the result of social interactions or exchanges in which the words, responses, presence, and behavior of other persons make reinforcements available and provide the setting for reinforcement. So, most of the social reinforcements are symbolic and verbal rewards for participating or for agreeing with group norms and expectations. So, doing something in accordance with group norms, is the way to go, great job, pat on the back, fist bump, friendly grin. And then non social reinforcement refers primarily to physiological factors or material acquisition that may be relevant for some crimes, such as drug-related offenses or burglary. And so what Akers posited is that the social reinforcement, those high fives, pats on the backs, attaboy, that feeling of social acceptance is more important than the non-social reinforcement of things like material goods. Discriminative stimuli are social signals or gestures transmitted by subcultural or peer groups to indicate whether certain kinds of behavior will be rewarded or punished within a particular social context. So again, this is sort of that social thing that can happen where Even if somebody feels like that behavior might be wrong or shouldn't be something that they engage in, that subcultural norm can make it feel like actually it is okay to do that, right? Because that's the norm and that's kind of the expectation. And that can play heavily into deviant behavior. Frustration induced criminality. So this is basically saying that when behavior is directed at a specific goal is blocked, arousal increases and the individual experiences a drive to reduce it. So the frustration of not, getting something that they thought would be rewarded, if that makes sense, causes that frustration. So then we have the socialized offender and the individual offender. The socialized offender is a person who violates the law consistently because of learning the behavioral patterns from his or her social environment. And the individual offender is the person who offends after a series of frustrations and unmet needs. So really, if some, people who anticipate reaching a goal and feel that they have some personal control over their lives are more likely to react strongly to interference than those who feel hopeless. So that's an interesting concept, right? That those people who still have some hope over the control of their own outcome, of their own lives, actually are kind of more dangerous in this scenario than people who kind of abandoned all hope and feel powerless. Frustration and crime. The role of frustration in criminal behavior can be complex and also maybe a matter of degree. So, the idea of the more intense and frequent the thwarting or frustration in a person's life, the more susceptible and sensitive the person is to subsequent frustration. Um, of course, some theories around early parental neglect having a big impact on that, so that that frustration is building very early on in life with needs, emotional, maybe even sometimes physical needs being unmet by caregivers, and then certainly can compound with social problems in life. An example of this would be a student who perpetrates a school shooting. Generally, looking back into their history, there have been a string of that feeling of being thwarted or frustrated, right? And being kind of outcast. So thinking of kind of that snowball effect into kind of that bubbling up of criminal behavior. Situational instigators and regulators of criminal behavior. So, the concept of this fundamental attribution error refers to a common human tendency to discount the influence of the situation and explain behavior by referring to the personality of the actor instead. So, an example would be when correctional counselors were asked why inmates had committed the crimes that put them in prison, the counselors attributed the causes almost exclusively to dispositional or personality factors, rather than to environmental factors. The inmates, on the other hand, said that the factors they believe landed them in prison were largely external in nature, such as poverty, poor employment opportunities, and physical and sexual abuse. So when it comes to ourselves, we really engage in self-serving biases, right? Like not doing well on a test and then and saying to ourselves, saying to whoever that it was a really hard test, right? Um, and then when we do well on a test, we say, well, we studied really hard for it, right? So it's kind of that idea of asserting that you had, more control when things go well, less control when things haven't gone well. Okay, so now we're going to get into some pretty interesting, I think, parts of this chapter. I'm not going to go too deep into. Oh, wait. Okay, that's a little further down. Okay, so this concept I think is very interesting, like I said, and interesting what happens to people when an authority figure is telling them to do something that is, you know, criminal in outcome, right? So, a crime of obedience is an act performed in response to orders from authority that is considered illegal or immoral by the larger community. The examples given here would, military detention centers, and then the massacre that happened in the Vietnam War. So the idea of what happens to human psychology when somebody in a position of authority is directing them to complete a criminal behavior tends to have a pretty interesting outcome. And it's not just like, I know it's easy to be on the outside and to be looking in on situations like Nazi concentration camps, for example, and thinking, how would anyone ever, do that? And then realizing that actually most people would. Most people actually do follow along with kind of these crimes of obedience. So the Milgram experiments came to be when Stanley Milgram designed a series of experiments, and participants were persons who volunteered for money in response to a newspaper ad. The experiments, which eventually received intensive public scrutiny and are now cited in nearly every introductory psychology textbook, studied the amount of electrical shock people were willing to administer to others when ordered to do so by an apparent authority figure. So what happened is, here's the experiment. There was the people who signed up to be part of the study, and then you had somebody who was essentially pretending to be shocked, right, with this electrical shock machine. The people who signed up for the experiment did not know that the person wasn't actually being shocked. They believed that while they were being instructed to shock that person, that was actually happening. And the player, the person who was, pretending to be shocked, was screaming, banging on the walls, pleading for them to stop, right? So making these people believe that they were actually being shocked. And so they had, in the room was the person with the control of the shocker and the authority figure. And so the labels on the shocking machine indicated slight shock, danger, severe shock, and beyond to an XXX level. So every time the learner gave an incorrect answer to a learning task, the quote teacher was instructed to administer a stronger level of shock. Okay, So the person who's playing that they're getting shocked is intentionally giving wrong answers so that they would be receiving the shock, right? So Milgram really wanted to discover how far people would go under the orders of this authority figure, right? Um, Almost two-thirds of the subjects obeyed the experimenter and administered the maximum shock levels. When the participant resisted giving the shock, the experimenter was instructed to pressure them, like by saying, please continue, or the experiment requires that you continue, and so on. So what happened was two-thirds of people just went along with that. And even though the person who was pretending to be shocked was screaming and begging for them to stop, continued to escalate that shock because the authority figure was telling them to do so. So also interesting about this experiment was a lot of people displayed some behaviors that indicated a high level of anxiety about continuing to administer the shock and did it anyway. So that's interesting. And then also, of course, ethical concerns and controversy all over this thing, right? So, of course, the immediate ethical concern is what was the emotional fallout for the people who believed that they had administered that shock. Interestingly enough, it was not good. And interestingly enough, still not good even when they learned that that person hadn't actually been shocked. Still the amount of psychological angst that created because of these people then knowing that they participated in that, right? That in the moment they thought they were really shocking somebody like that, and they continued to do it. So so interesting experiment, surprising. Again, I think easy to be on the outside looking in, and be able to judge and say, I would never do that, right? Doesn't appear for humans to be quite so cut and dry. So, very interesting. So de-individuation theory is based on the classic crowd theory of Gustave Le Bon. This really describes a process by which individuals feel they cannot be identified primarily because they are disguised or are subsumed within a group. And because of this, there's some removal of self-imposed controls and neutralizing internalized moral restraints. So then, these prison studies, I'm not going to go too much into them because I really want you to read about them in depth here because they're incredibly important studies. And then also, there's a couple of videos posted in your assignments this week that I'd like you to watch about these prison experiments. So again, I'm not going to go too deeply into them, but I do really want you to read about them in your textbook. And then I really want you to read those videos. Again, if you've taken general psychology, you've already studied these, and that's okay because you can always learn more. So really, when going back to this, going to the de-individuation and crowd violence. So the powerful effects of crowds on individual behavior has really been an interesting thing for social scientists since the early 1900s. So crowd influence usually studied under the rubric of negative collective behavior. So including riots, gang rapes, panics, lynchings, violent demonstrations, and revolutions. But collective behavior can also have a positive connotation. As is the case with peaceful protests, demonstrations, marches, sit-ins, tent-ins, and all those different things. So because we're studying criminal behavior, we're really more concerned with collective behavior as it affects the instigation and maintenance of violence or illegal activities, right? So, um, mob actions, this kind of, I'm sure we've all heard like the term mob mentality, right? Um, Mob actions include extensive violence. Those are actually kind of a rare occurrence. Um, but the idea of kind of the mob mentality of like it's talking about right in that in the de-individuation, there appears to be some relaxing of internalized moral structures, and whether that's because of sort of that um, collective energy build or that feeling of being anonymous, giving people kind of more um, granting themselves more permission to do things they would not otherwise do if they could be recognized, all of those things coming into play. Um, so the bystander effect. The bystander effect really, um, the bystander effect is also very interesting. Again, it's like kind of going back to that idea of those crimes by obedience, of saying, oh, I would never, right? Or if I was in that situation, this is what I would do. Interestingly enough, not always the case, as has been studied by what's referred to as the bystander effect. So this famous case, which you may already have studied or heard about, um, was with a 28-year-old woman in 1964, um, Kitty Genovese, and she was walking home um, from work to her apartment in Queens, New York, and realized that she was being followed by a man. So she tried to run away and was unable to get away. So he caught her, slammed her to the ground, stabbed her twice in the back. She screamed for help. All these lights are on in these adjacent apartments. Nobody comes to her to help her. So the assailant, stabs her. She's screaming for help. He runs away, probably assuming someone was going to help her, realizes that nobody's coming, runs back, does more injury to her, rapes her, stabs her. Um, this entire incident is happening out on the street and took approximately 45 minutes. According to newspaper reports, none of the 38 witnesses helped her during the entire time. Um, so it does happen that for some reason, and sometimes it's because people assume that somebody else is going to do something about it, or somebody else is going to call 911, or somebody else is going to intervene, that people don't intervene to help other people. Um, her case had some, positive outcomes, Good Samaritan laws, right? Um, Good Samaritan laws, basically like you need to help somebody. And also, that's when 911 came about so that it was an easy number to remember. There were later on some, reports that some neighbors did maybe try to help, yelling out the window and that sort of thing, but nobody ran outside. Somebody did report later that they called the police and it took them a long time to get there. So, what's interesting though about this bystander effect is that students who learn about it are less likely to engage in it. So that's you guys. So now that you know that that's a thing that can happen, it's on you to not be one of the people who keeps driving or who thinks, I don't need to do anything because somebody else is definitely going to help, right? No, everybody needs to help when something is going wrong. Obviously, like keeping yourself safe is important. But yeah, calling 911, doing something, and not just assuming somebody else will take care of it is important. Moral disengagement. So, moral agency is having the agency to behave in a moral manner. Moral disengagement, of course, then is detachment from those moral principles. So Bandura really proposed that this concept of moral disengagement explains why people do things that they know are not, quote, right, both on their own and when ordered to do so by some higher authority or under social pressure. This concept of moral disengagement kind of helps explain how otherwise good people can act illegally or inhumanely and still feel good about themselves. And then that kind of like goes into play here with this table on page 128, table 4.2. There are all of these methods and of moral disengagement, 8 of them. Probably the most harmful, I would say, would be this dehumanization. So, viewing a person as not human or inferior, right, to the perpetrator. So we all know that came into play absolutely in the escalation of the Nazis and what happened in the concentration camps. It also easier to mistreat or kill strangers who, you don't know, right? Who a person doesn't know. Once a person is dehumanized, no longer viewed as persons with feelings, hopes, and concerns, but as subhuman forms. So, this is where the power of language comes into play, right? And hate speech can really lead to this escalation in dehumanization. And as we are learning, that can be dangerous in escalation towards criminal behavior and hate crimes, right? So take a look at that table there on page 128. And it has nice little definitions of all of them and examples. And that, my friends, is the lecture for this week. So, I hope you have a good week. I hope you enjoy those videos about the prison studies, prison experiments, and find them as appalling as they are. And I will talk back at you next week. All right, thanks, guys.